Today I'm speaking with Arun Lucas and Craig Sullivan, both from the UK, and Arun is Managing Director from Zooko, the form analytics software platform and form optimization consultancy. And Craig is also known as Optimize or Die and the all-round CRO hero in our industry. Craig is someone who has been running iterative user-centered form design since 2001 and A/B testing them since 2004. So a lot of experience around the table today. We talk about all the things that can make or break the forms on your website. This episode is made possible by our partners Chameleon and Online Influence Institute. My name is Guido Jansen and welcome to the CRO Cafe podcast.
It's a good question to start with. Why are forms important? And really the way that I look at these is that they are a lens or doorway onto a service, a product, a process. And often form interactions are a key part of the start of your relationship with a company, right? And it's going to characterize the way that you feel about that whole product experience is being funneled through a form interaction. So these are doorways into your product or service. Sometimes they're low intent. In most cases, they're very high intent entry point. So it's incredibly important to get right because the way that people feel about your brand is a sum of all the interactions, the messages, how easy they found it to use. So if you have a terrible form, they're already feeling bad about your brand before you've even begun a relationship. So it's a doorway and the first part in hopefully a long-term fruitful relationship.
And just to build on that, Craig, with some data, we at Zooko, we've obviously got a benchmark of hundreds, thousands, if not thousands of forms. And when we look at that, kind of the average form across everything, on the average form, about 2/3 of form visitors never convert. So that's 2/3. Anyone who goes to your form does not successfully complete. So there's always a big room for improvement. This is why they're so important. You may spend millions of euros, pounds, dollars getting people to your site, even pushing people towards your form. But then if you don't know why they're dropping off and you're not doing the analysis, and that point, which many companies don't, it's like a big black box for them. If you're not doing that, then you're missing a trick.
And then using the analogy of forms being a doorway, would you say that on most sites nowadays we have these GDPR cookie notifications? Would you say that's already a form? You can start with a really simple, basic form, choose your cookie setting, and then to go forward?
Yeah. And those can be confusing too, but it's also about balance and compliance and ease of use. One of the interesting things I've discovered recently from A/B testing cookie messages, and Amazon are actually doing this, is by having a cookie message that completely dominates the viewport. Is like, you cannot use this site until you have used the cookie message. You would think that's a really bad thing to do from a UX point of view, but not really if it massively improves your data quality and opt-in rates, right? If you have a tiny little cookie message down the bottom right that you hardly ever see, then people will have a whole session where they forget to make the choice, so you're not tracking them at all, as legally you shouldn't be doing. But also you end up with all the session data that doesn't have the first few page views of the session data. So your data is rubbish, right? So there's a data quality issue and an opt-in issue that can actually be massively improved by the design of one tiny form interaction, which is the cookie message, and actually making it really big so it takes up almost all of the mobile viewport is a really good way of saying, look, you really have to make a choice. Let's get the cookie thing out of the way, right? And then you can see the page, right? And that was counterintuitive to me at first, but I A/B tested it. And when you see data opt-in rates going from 40 to 73%, then you can't really argue against that. It worked, right?
And I guess it depends a bit on the website and how motivated that user is. I mean, when you go to Amazon, I want that product, right? So I'm really motivated to go forward to that. But if you're visiting a website and the motivation is quite low, maybe I want to read an article there, but semi-interested, and then I see this big pop-up and then say, okay, well, never mind then.
But it's also about the psychology of the options and the placement of the buttons, right? There's NOYB.EU has been talking about deceitful practice here, but good practice here is to make it really clear. You have two options. You either I accept it, the cookies, right? It's cool. Cookies are fine, right? The second choice should not be reject all cookies. The second option should be I wish to control my cookies or customize them or manage them. Then when you click on that, you go to a submenu that has all the cookies defaulted off and a button that says apply cookie settings. And then people can adjust them if they like. But essentially it does exactly the same thing of giving them the option to reject, but it's not presented as a binary choice of accept or reject. It's saying, if you are someone who is worried about your privacy and wish to exercise control over some of these cookie options, then this is the flow for you, right? For everybody else, just click the accept button. But the way it's presented with accept or reject sometimes leads to a much lower data opt-in rate because of the way that the question is framed, right?
Yeah. And you guys, to go back to all forms, you guys made a nice list of a lot of parts that forms consist of, and the idea is to go through them one by one, all these issues that you might encounter when optimizing for forms. And really glad that you guys can share your experience with how you guys do that. Yeah. So let's start with the first one, mobile versus desktop forms. The differences in optimization you need to be aware of when using those. Craig?
There are really two key differences that you're going to encounter when you start exhaustively testing forms across multiple devices. And the first thing you're going to figure out is that you need to use real hardware in your hand, right? Simulators, emulators, even cloud devices are not perfect, right? Because it's not a real phone, okay? So I always recommend to people to use real hardware and actually figure out what the hardware is that their customers are actually using on their site. You know, is it 70% iPhones, 30% Android? Do you even know? Have you run the data to see what people are arriving at your site with that it should work on, right? This is a traffic question. You need to answer that one. So usually the total cost of that testing hardware for most companies is less than 1,500 euros, right? And I can confidently say for over 90% of you out there, if you have an iPhone 8 size phone, you know, a 4.7 inch, a 6.1 inch size iPhone XR, a Samsung S10, a Mac laptop, and a Windows laptop, that will act as a proxy for between 85 and 95% of your revenue and traffic, right? So if your stuff works on those devices, and you can check this in your data, then what you do is you test your site with those devices. You know, it's like, what cars do people bring into our garage? Oh, it seems to be all Jaguar cars. Maybe we should learn how to fix Jaguar cars then. That would be really cool. So use the knowledge that you have in your data, be data-driven about how you know which are the golden geese of devices that you must not kill when you are building or changing sites. But the most common problems that we see are really to do with viewports and device integration. So the size of your screen, a lot of people don't know this, but the viewport on mobile is, if not the biggest, one of the biggest determinants of your conversion rate, right? Because of the way that the content fits inside the available space. If you scale it or do a bad job of fitting it, right, on that device, then you will get lower conversion. And if your design works great on your massive big iPhone, right, yay, I've got a 6.5 inch iPhone and it works on mine, that does not mean it will work on a small phone. Whereas if if you have a small iPhone and your design works on that, I can guarantee you it will work fine on all of the other phones. It's an axiomatic rule. If it works in a small viewport, then it's probably likely it's going to work fine in a big viewport. So that's one of the problems. Second problem is device integration. You've got different keyboard handling, you've got cameras, you've got native payment stuff, you've got autofill and filling in your passwords, right? So it's really important to actually take advantage of the device hardware, right? And understand the device hardware from an HTML point of view.
Yeah, I mean, those emulators, they often have this like theoretical largest viewport, but they don't always account for like browser bars taking up space. And then, yeah, like you said, with forms and keyboards, it happens quite often that the pop-up keyboard actually covers the form, and you cannot see what you're typing.
Yeah, or it's the wrong keyboard. That's a very common problem. Or people have autocorrect turned on in the forms, you know. So layout stuff is pretty common in mobile, either the help, the messages, the chat control is over the top of the content. The help button is over the top of the form content. Yep. There's a back to top thing, so you can't click the button because it's over the button. There's a sticky header or a sticky footer or a sticky add to cart that interferes, or a sticky submit button that interferes with the form. So usually there are a number of formatting and layout problems. Functionally, things just don't work as they should within the viewport of mobile. Somebody has thought they've designed a mobile form, but they've never really tried to use it on a mobile, right? Designing it and seeing it being used are two entirely different things.
So make sure you cover like 85% of your users with physical devices.
4 or 5 devices will cover it for most companies, you know, and buy the hardware. The ROI that you will get if you're spending any money on advertising or hiring people or building digital product, it's expensive, right? The cost of the hardware, you will get ROI on that within days or weeks, because you won't have broken advertising and you won't have broken forms on your website. And those two things cost more money than the cost of buying the sodding hardware in the first place to make sure it works.
Exactly. It sounds like extra work, but it's saving you a lot of money actually in the end. Okay, next one, the submit button.
So submit button, kind of what I'd like to talk about here is we find often when we do analysis that, you know, this is often the biggest uplift for people who are optimizing their forms, because you have users, they've spent all the time filling out the form, getting through, you know, whatever you're asking them. They click submit, but they still don't convert. And why is that? These are people, they want to give you money, they want to give you their details, and they still can't do it. So if you want to get to identify some of the problem issues in your forms, looking at the submit button is often the quickest way of doing that. So the things you look at is you look at the data and say, what's happening after the submit button? After they try to submit, what are they doing? So firstly, what error messages are they seeing at that point? Which form fields are they returning to try and fix? And then do they return multiple times to those fields? Do they not? What do they do? Do they abandon at that point? Or do they, you know, often we see it a lot that people try 5, 6, 7 times to fix a field, and it's often a simple field like phone number, and they still can't do it. And it's like, well, people don't forget their own phone number. So there is something you are doing that is preventing someone who wants to give you their money, and you've messed it up, you've lost them. So often those are the biggest returns. Maybe not an overall conversion rate, but certainly in terms of revenues, often you see those big jumps when you start looking at it.
I saw this once at an auction website where people, it was mandatory to have an account at the auction website. But it was a huge form, but the auction, I mean, the auction ends in 10, 9, 8. So there's a lot of time pressure there. And we saw a lot of people just filling out their email address, only their email address, then hit submit, then fill another form, hit submit again, then just try to get into to the auction. And that didn't work. And a lot of failed submissions there.
Yeah, exactly. So I think this is, typically the first thing we look at is the submit button, what's happening to people who are submitting but not succeeding. And if you use the data on that often gets you some quick answers.
Yeah, and specifically with e-commerce, I guess that's with e-commerce, the submit button is not always the end of the process. So you submit all your data on the e-commerce website, but then you go to an external payment provider, and that might also indicate a problem there.
Yeah, and you can identify what's going on.
It's a classic data analysis piece. We spend a lot of time analyzing, why people do and don't convert across a whole site, or what stuff they buy or what combination of stuff. We do all this analysis. Yeah, when it comes to the form, a key entry point, we're not nearly doing enough data analysis. Most companies don't have form analytics that gives them this kind of data about what is happening inside the form. So the form remains a black box. Customers go in, some of them die and never make it out, and then a small trickle comes out the other end. And if it's like a black box like that, then you don't actually know what's going on inside, and it means that you can't optimize it.
Yeah. Okay, next one. Mobile keyboard layouts and autocorrect.
One of the funniest things here was a really large telco company who came to me and said, "This is really strange, Craig, but the most edited field on our checkout form is the customer name on the first page. Is there a problem here? Because we thought people would be able to spell their names okay." And I was like, yeah, after you get to about 5 or 6, it's not too much of a problem after that. You can generally spell your name properly. And so I went and tested the form and found out that autocorrect was turned on in the name field, right? And unless you have a name that's in the dictionary, right? So you have a nice white Anglo-Saxon Protestant name, right? Then it's great. You'll be in the dictionary. Yay. And it won't try and correct it. If you have, like a couple of my friends, a Turkish name, right? Then it's going to indirectly discriminate against you because it's going to say that's a stupid name and correct it to something else. So this is why the re-edits were the highest, because lots of their customers were having to go and change the auto-corrected name back to the original one. The same happens with email address. If you have auto-capitalize on in an email address field, it doesn't matter if you have a capital in your email address field, but customers of websites do not know this. So if you put a capital in their email address, they will go, "They've got my email address wrong," and they will go back and edit the email field to take the capital out, right? Because they're scared the form is going to reject them later on, right? It's crazy, but it's true, and you have to understand these things. So one of the biggest problems is that huge amounts of mobile sites have the wrong keyboard set, right? There are, you have 4 keyboard layouts on mobile. You've got one for emails, you've got one for phone number, right? You've got one for numbers, and then you've got text, right? And just make sure you use the darned right keyboard layout, right? It really annoys users in usability tests. They get really frustrated with this. Plus, your data quality goes down because if the keys to put in a phone number are over 500% larger than they are on the alphanumeric keyboard, what do you think the chances are that they will find it easier to type in their phone number? They're like 5 times bigger, right? It's way easier. So there's less friction from doing this. But this is one of these strange things where a tiny change can have a massive difference in your form conversion, because this really annoys people, right? Quite rightly.
Yeah, you can also make mistakes with that, right? I mean, with the postcode field, the zip code field, for some countries, this will be numbers only. But for other countries, that will include letters too.
Yeah.
So you need to be careful with that. And talking about those kind of, this borders on validation, I guess. So the next topic, inline validation. Yeah, to make sure basically, on the one hand, to help the users, but also to make sure that your own data quality is okay.
Yes. So, inline validation obviously is one of the things that we see consistently make a big difference to form conversion. So there was a study by Luke Wroblewski a few years ago now, but still very relevant. He saw a 22% uplift in forms that used inline validation versus those that didn't. And we see that as well whenever any of our clients implement it. And by that, I mean, essentially, you are validating the customer's answer when they put it in. And now there's basically this helps in a number of ways. Firstly, you don't have the issue I talked about before about the submit button triggering all the error messages. You get the error message almost immediately. You don't have all the stress of that causes. The key, obviously, is to trigger it at the right time. And Craig, I think, Craig has coined a phrase, premature error ejaculation. I think you don't want to make it too soon. You don't want to give someone an error just as soon as they start typing.
I think it happens to me quite often when they use those validation on the email field, and if there's no at in it or not a dot in it, then it throws an error message. But of course you don't start with the at symbol, so you get an error right away.
Exactly. I mean, typically, we find the best way to do it is as soon as someone moves on from a field, so they focus on the next field. That's when you trigger it. And that is the most efficient way to do it, because they're then like, okay, I'll go back and I'll amend it. I'm going to talk about error messages in particular later, so I won't jump ahead. But obviously, this is one of the biggest factors we see in improving a form's conversion rate. Tell people they've made an error almost immediately after they have.
Yeah.
If you do enough user testing with people walking through forms and talking out loud, you'll quickly discover that unlike sort of people who work professionally with this stuff, they have increasingly raised cortisol levels as they go through filling out a form, right? And I could see it on people's faces, right? It's been measured in research. And the answer behind it is that the fear grows as they fill out the form, that it's going to come up with a sea of red error messages when they press the submit button, right? And this is why inline validation works really well. But I've also run 3 A/B tests where we took the same form design, no other changes. One of them did the checking on submit. One of them did inline validation. And the third method was to put a tick or feedback, right, or color shading to indicate, yes, you have successfully passed that field. That job is done. And the best converting one was always that one. The inline validation massively increased the conversion, but we got another raise off giving people feedback that they had passed the validation rules inside the form.
So you say you should put this on every field, even if it's just if the check is just did you fill out this field? Then that's already
correct. Even if it's your name, right? And I worried that people would feel patronized, oh, you've got your name right, tick, like you would feel offended. But no, we tested it in the lab. The feedback I do get is people say at the end of the testing, I wish all forms were like this. It tells you how you're doing as you go along, so that you know that when you get to the button at the end, you're not going to have any errors because it's told you already that everything is right.
There's no anxiety
so
anymore.
The cortisol vanishes, right? There's no anxiety building in the form. And that building anxiety does not help your chances of conversion, right? In fact, the biggest correlation with form abandonment is the presence of one or more errors in the process. So if you can avoid throwing any errors, you will massively increase your form conversion rate.
But it can still be tricky, right? So if someone fills in their name wrong, or what we just spoke about, there's an autocorrect, and you move to the next field, the name is wrong, but you still get this green tick box.
Yeah, that's true.
But those are situations that still
But there's
happen.
nothing that we can do. There's nothing that we can do about that. But people tend to notice on mobile that the autocorrect is happening because it's highlighted color-wise in the viewport, and it's quite a sudden change, right? So you can see a data value you've just typed where your eye focus is pretty close to suddenly change, right? And that's also jarring for users. It's not just the fact that you've changed the spelling of their name, it's the fact that something has suddenly changed in the interface that they weren't expecting.
Yeah, and if you're doing it right, like we just said, the check should only take place after someone moves to the next field, right? So I would expect people to correct their name first before moving on to the next field anyway.
And what about people who have short last name. So a friend of mine who has Ng as his last name, right? It forms all the time reject his surname because they say it must have 3 or 4 minimum characters, right? Who came up with that idea? Like somebody who didn't have many friends from around the world.
Exactly. Yeah, and the same with first names, of course. Yeah. Talking to the world's greatest optimization experts here at Zero Cafe convinced me that there are just 2 features that separate a good from a great optimization platform. It must make optimization easy for your whole team, and it must scale. Chameleon does both. It's a single unified web and full-stack experimentation platform with AI-powered personalization and feature flagging. I especially like Chameleon Hybrid, which lets you continue to use any client-side MarTech you like to help build and analyze server-side tests without relying on developers. Learn more about Chameleon at www.kameleon.com. Next one, confirming the email and password fields.
Why do we do this anymore? Because it's not necessary. As you pointed out, Guido, earlier on, people can know their email address, right? Zooko's experience is removing confirm password got 56% increase in conversion, whilst password resets remain steady. I've run the same experiments. I've removed email and password confirmation off many sites where people were scared it was going to cause a problem, and it did not, right? The fact that you have not tried something does not mean it's not going to work. It just means you haven't tried it yet and you don't know, right? People know their names and email addresses pretty well. You know, what I would consider adding is a validator. So you check for common transpositional or typos in emails. So gmail.com. If you look at, there's a site called westwing.de, try typing in your email wrongly in there and it will say, did you mean
Nice. Yep.
you know, Craig Sullivan at gmail.com, and you go, oh yeah, it's being helpful, right? It's not telling you off and saying you're bad, you've got a bad email. It's saying, oh look, you've mistyped it, but look, I fixed it for you. It's what Google does when you mistype stuff. It doesn't tell you off. It says, I know what you mean. Yeah. You can't spell, but I know what you're looking for because I'm a computer and I'm smart. That's what we were built for. Don't confirm the password, right? You should have a little icon that lets you see the password you're typing on mobile so that you don't put errors into it, right? But also, you don't need to do this confirmation thing and rules thing, right? You should just give feedback. Is it a strong or a weak password? That's up to the user, right? Let them choose, but don't make them type in these things twice. There is no earthly reason why it's needed.
Yeah, and I also never got, also from a technical workflow perspective, why websites ask for like an email once and then a password twice, and to confirm it. Because if you have your email wrong, that's a way bigger problem, because now you're creating an account that you cannot get access to anymore because it's not sending confirmation emails to your actual email. But if you have your password wrong, there's a backup because you can reset your password and it goes to the right email address. So also from that perspective, it doesn't make sense to have a password field twice.
I've tested this and not seen any noticeable impact on data quality, especially when you have a kind of common email error handling routine that corrects stuff. You know, there's a limited number of domains. If you take all the domains out of your website and analyze them, you'll probably find a very small amount of email domains make up a huge percentage, right? You can use your own data to create validation rules to fix people's stuff automatically. Yeah. Be nice.
Exactly. Be nice. And talking about being nice, error messages.
Yes, so error messages. We've talked and touched on it quite a lot today. But again, often this is one of the things to get right, because surprisingly, there's a lot of sites out there that don't do them right. Firstly, as you say, be nice, be helpful. Make sure that error messages that you are telling people aren't just, this is wrong, this is incorrect. Tell them, okay, this is incorrect because, as Craig said, maybe your Gmail account. You put in the wrong email address. Maybe you're missing an at, a dot, whatever it may be. Be specific to help the user. Importantly, make sure the error messages are displayed in the right place, typically next to or just below the relevant field, so people know. And again, ideally triggering at the time of input. We've all been on forms where you either click submit and you're like, there's errors. Where are the errors? I don't know. What's wrong? And you have to scroll back up to the very top of the form to see what the errors are. Or even worse, sometimes they're below the fold, below the submit button. You're like, I have no clue what's going on. And eventually you work it out. It's in a different font and it's right at the bottom. And you're like,
especially on mobile, right? There's a high chance that it's out of your viewport.
Exactly, yeah. And by that time, you've gone, you've got to be pretty highly motivated to do that. So make sure it looks like an error messages as well. I mean, I've seen error messages just in standard black or grey type. People miss it all the time. We're conditioned to not like red, so error messages should be in red because it will, trigger I need to do something rather than, it's another bit of text. Never be accusative in them. Never blame the user. Never say it's your fault. You've got this wrong. Just be factual in the message. Don't annoy them. And then the final point is prevention is always better than cure. Best not to have an error message in the first place. Best that your instructional microcopy is good enough so most people don't make the message. That your validation is not overly restrictive on phone numbers or emails that does it. And of course, ideally, you have inline validation so you tell them straight away there as well. And I think, Craig's worked on a lot of defaults and error patterns in the past that are pretty successful that we'll put in the show notes that people can just steal.
Yeah, the gov.uk one works, used at several places, and it's been tested at scale, qualitatively and quantitatively. So steal it, it works. That's what the internets are for.
The internet is for stealing.
Yes, exactly. Steal, rebuild, repurpose, rework.
Nice. Next one, I think we touched upon it briefly also, the password rules, how strong they should be.
Yeah, there's a kind of fallacy here that I don't know how it's developed, but people think that by imposing really complex password rules onto users, that it actually protects the security of their business. It doesn't, because hackers don't attack individual accounts. They attack at a platform level, right? Unless, of course, you're a celebrity or somebody who has an interest in gaining access to your information. And there are different ways of handling that. Amazon always has you logged in, but when you try and access really sensitive stuff, it will ask you to authenticate again. Yep. So it's like a layered set of authentication. It's very clever if you study it, but they don't have these complex password rules. Why? Because they don't effing work, right? Strict requirements are less safe, right? So here's the problem. If you put in all these complex password rules, users then have to create a password that's really, really complicated, but they can't remember it, right? So what they then do is they end up using that same password on multiple sites, right? So a hacker then breaks into one of those websites, but now they have the access to your Facebook password and your LinkedIn password and your Gmail password and all your other passwords because you used the same one, right? So it's one of the most stupid things we have ever done on the internet, and there is no need for it because the strength comes from the entropy in the password. People don't understand the maths. It's not about the complexity, right? Length actually works better. So Elon Musk tax bill shock is way stronger than some really complicated password with symbols and special characters in it, right? So there's a great XKCD cartoon that says we've spent 20 years making it harder for humans to remember passwords and easier for computers to guess them. And that's the fundamental problem. So the rule should be 8 characters minimum, right? No rules. Give them feedback on the strength. So say, weak, medium, strong, very strong, so that they can decide, you give them encouragement to have a stronger password. You don't tell them off that it doesn't meet minimum rules. and the support cost of handling the resets. If you're going to go and buy a product and you're like in that mood of, yeah, I want to buy that thing, and you go there and it's like, oh, you need to log in, and you're like, oh, I can't remember my password. So you press the password reset, but they don't send them out immediately. They only send them out every 15 minutes. But you're waiting in your inbox. The reset email never comes. So then you never buy the product. Yeah. The email comes later, and then you think, no, I already bought it somewhere else. So resetting passwords costs you huge amounts of money, and there is no security gain from this kind of stupidity.
Yeah, I think a lot of people listening will know Correct Horse battery staple from the XKCD comic.
Yeah, Horse Correct battery staple. Yeah, got to watch that cartoon. That explains it perfectly, right? Really stupid things, stop doing it.
And but I do see, and I once tried to log out of Amazon. I challenge you all to after this podcast go try to log out of Amazon. It doesn't really it's really hard to do actually. But I do see more and more services these days that don't use passwords at all. They just ask for your email address and then send you a login link every time you try to log in. You only provide your email address and then just send you a link to log in.
Medium has been passwordless now for about 2 years. It's great. It works fine. There's no passwords, right? Yep. You don't even need passwords for a lot of systems. Passwords are like some evil thing that we developed to solve a problem a while back, but we've never changed away from because we're stupid, right? There are better things than passwords, right?
I'm not sure if we're stupid, we're definitely lazy.
But it's a good point. Whilst passwords are around, you've got to integrate with native device capabilities like autofill. So if your device or your browser remembers your password, or you have a password manager system, then you must make sure that your forms are compatible with this, because then the user doesn't actually have to type them in. You completely remove all of the friction, right? We can't fix all the websites on the internet to have nice, easy password rules, but we can at least make sure that these sites actually work with native device and browser capabilities to smooth or remove friction from that problem.
Next one, phone number fields, also an interesting one.
Yeah, so phone numbers, out of all the common form fields that you see on most forms, this is the one that we consistently see getting messed up. The first thing to ask with the phone number field is, do you actually need it? You know, there's been some research by the Baymard Institute which show that unexplained requests for a phone number are a major cause of abandonment. People are saying, why, you know, particularly in e-commerce, you have my address to send the item to, you have my email address to communicate with me. Why do you need my phone number? And if you don't tell them why, you know, if you have a valid reason, tell them why. If you don't, then they are going to be suspicious. That's point number one. Then also the execution of the phone number field, even if you have to ask for it, is often confusing. Again, Baymard, there's a Baymard study that show that, you know, regardless of how you ask for the phone number, 89% of users in their test entered it in a different format than was requested. So you're telling them to do something and they didn't, because there's so many different ways to do a phone number. Do you have the +44 or +31? Do you have spaces? Do you use brackets? People do it in different ways. And if you are overly restrictive, you're going to create errors and frustration. Just let them type it in the way you want. And if you're using it for your, you know, customer services representatives to call them, doesn't matter. They're human. They will read and they will use it, or sort it out at the back end, reformat it. Don't make the user have to think. You know, if you have to have the country code on, try and use a smart default to geolocate them beforehand, so they're not trying to remember what their country code is if they don't know. I think, Craig, you've had some specific experience on this, and typically you just let them do what they want and it doesn't cause any issues.
We actually put a rule in 39 countries, 19 different languages, and the rule is you take all the formatting out and you count up the number of numbers. And if there are 8 or more numbers, then you accept them, right? And it's never caused a problem. That company operates some of the largest call centers in the world, so you would expect there to be a data problem. But if somebody in London types in 8318-9290, it's a valid phone number, right? The person in the call center will look at that number and know, oh, that's 0208, right? You know, people are not stupid. They can work this stuff out. They know what the numbers are. It's us that's trying to impose rules. So just strip out all the numeric characters, count them up, and if there are 8 or more, send them through, right? It will work, right? If you want to be really strict, you can go for like 11, but 8 actually works worldwide. I've even checked this. I know what the telephone number setups are on even some of the smallest islands in the Pacific. I went and did the research, and 8 characters minimum will actually work for every country in the world. Another problem worth mentioning is if you do have to ring people, they won't recognize your number, right? So especially these days when people are suspicious, they'll see a number or the number will be withheld and they'll think, I don't know who that is. They can go to my voicemail. So if you actually text them before you're going to call them and say, hey, this is Company X here, we're just letting you know where that call that you requested for 10 a.m., it's in 15 minutes time and it's going to be coming from this number so that you recognize it when you pick it up and actually answer us.
But I suspect there's going to be an issue there when, if someone is calling manually, that's fine. They will recognize the number in whatever format it is. But if you're going to send those text messages, it's going to be really hard to automate that if those numbers are not in the correct format. So,
but why
if there's any automation in text messages, then.
Well, if you strip the numbers out of them, what you're going to end up with is either a number that has a country code in front of it, like 44, right? And then you're going to have a mobile number, right? If it has 0 in it after the front number that looks like an ISO country code, then you can strip the 0 out, right? I don't really see any problem here. I've been able to automate this stuff perfectly fine. So people will, especially with American numbers, people will format them in a number of different ways, right? Depending on where they are, what age they are. Some will put brackets in, some will not put the area code in because they'll just put the local number, right? So, but all of these are acceptable. We think that, computers can't process them and human beings can't process them, and we're wrong on both counts. We can fix them both ways.
Yeah, and I guess even if there are exceptions, for the majority, those SMS messages will go fine, and in those 1% of cases it doesn't. You get an error message back, and then you can have a human look at it. So that's your problem solved. I also had an anecdote from a test that we did, a user test, and it was actually on a website, a gifting website, and the phone number was mandatory for the person receiving that gift. So there's even an extra step of worry there. That's okay, but I'm not gonna fill in the phone number of my girlfriend or my mother, and there was no explanation again. There was no explanation. Okay, we're gonna send them a message, or we're gonna use it for XYZ. 0, just the phone number of the person receiving, and an asterisk behind it indicating it's a mandatory field.
It's a negotiation.
And a lot of people got angry at me during that user test.
Well, walk up to somebody randomly at a party with a piece of paper and a pen and say, phone number. Right, and see what they say to you, right? They might throw their drink in your face, right? But if you give them a reason, there was a famous study of photocopier queues that if you pushed in the front of the queue and gave a reason, then people were more likely to allow you to do your photocopying, right? By saying, oh, my time is running out on the meter on the car. I've got to photocopy these now. And they were like, oh, okay, go on then, right? Whereas if you just push in without consent or permission, people get quite cross about it.
Yeah, and I remember from that specific study that even giving a reason is better than even giving where it works way better than giving no reason, and giving a valid reason is only incrementally better. I think the phrase that they used with that study that you mentioned is that if you have basically, can I skip the line, is like 60% success if you have 5 copies, and if you ask, can I skip the line because I need to make some copies, obviously. It's not a good reason, but then already that 60% goes up to 95%. That's incredible. And just adding a valid reason, can I skip the line because I'm in a hurry? Then you go up to 98%. So it's only really small.
Give them a reason for supplying the information. A form is a negotiation, not a hostage demand, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Next one, labels and field design. I think we'll see more and more the copies of how Google is doing the Google material design when the label's actually in the field, and once you click it moves above. That's a trend of the last couple of years, but not always positive.
There's a problem in the implementation of some of those. So there are kind of three core patterns here. There's left-aligned labels, there's right-aligned, and there's top-aligned to start with, right? And there are actually different reasons for using the three. Left-aligned is good when the labels are really complex information that you don't actually know, right? So the information in the left-hand edge of the labels is more important than them lining up closely with the fields, right? Otherwise, right-aligned and top-aligned work better, right? And top-aligned label works best of all, right? Material design or certain things that try to copy elements of material design put the field label inside the field, right? Inline labels are bad, right? Because as soon as you start typing, you don't know what the field is, right? The doorbell rings, you look away for 2 seconds, you look back at the screen. What am I typing here? I have no idea because the label has vanished, right? People do this to save space, but it's stupid because unless your mobile form is so small that it only fits in one window scroll, you're going to have to scroll anyway, right? So you're not really saving space. What you're doing is you think you're saving space, but you're actually cutting out on clarity.
Yeah, sometimes I see then when you click the field, I see the label move top line, so it moves to above the field. But that's also not...
that can work, but I find it jarring, right? Why not just put it above the field label there in the first place? Otherwise, what you're doing is animating parts of a form that you're trying to fill out. I don't see it's necessary because I've tested this and I know that top aligned works just fine, right? Second problem with the material design stuff is that your field labels are probably at base browser default 16 pixels 100% setting, right? So if you shrink the field label to stuff it up in the top left-hand corner, most people can't read it, especially people who wear glasses or contact lenses or whose sight isn't perfect. Right, so now you think you've been clever by shrinking the label, but actually you've made the label just unreadable now for half or more of the population. Right, so same problems as an inline label now because even though it's there, you can't actually see what it is because it's too small. So my optimal pattern still is a top-aligned label. And the reason for that also is because people look for empty box shapes to fill in. When people parse the form design, they evaluate the work involved in the form based on the size and shape of the empty boxes. When people look for a search box on an e-commerce site, they're looking for an empty white box. They're not actually looking for a box that has the words, please enter your search term or keyword in here, right? So you actually lose the visibility of the field by putting label information inside the field. So I'm with Luke Wroblewski on this one, top aligned labels all the way. And there's a design, we'll include some links in the resources to a design system that you can steal there. And there's a very good variant from gov.uk.
Nice. Alun, any additions on labels and field design?
No, nothing more to add than on Craig. Say ideally at the top with inline validation, as we said before.
Nice.
Yesterday's brainstorm was so good. I really liked Steph's idea of running that test on the call to action buttons. Making them orange will really make them stand out, don't you think?
Yeah, right. Do you want to design real A/B test winners and achieve enormous conversion uplift? Then stop brainstorming and take a scientific approach. If you can read Dutch, follow the steps in Online Invloed, the bestseller on managementboek.nl. or enroll in the author's course and become an expert in applying proven behavioral science yourself. Go to onlineinfluence.com for more information and free downloads. Then next one, drop-downs.
Yes, drop-downs. We still see drop-downs used far too much. I'm going to share it with the show notes, but I don't know if you've ever seen, it's quite a famous sketch by a British comedian called Michael McIntyre about forms, and he uses drop-downs he's trying to book a ticket at the local cinema, and then he has a list of every country in the world, and you get repetitive strain syndrome going up and down to try and find your country, and then you find out it's at the top anyway. So that's it sums up the problem better than I can. But from a scientific perspective, at Zuko we've done eye tracking research, and there's other studies as well that show it's not efficient at all. People are moving up and down. They don't know what's going on. Using the date of birth field as an example, it's much simpler to have 3 separate text boxes. So that six inputs, or versus, up, down, etc. It creates a bad user experience that you don't need. So really, there's rare situations where you should be using drop downs. You should use alternatives. You should look at radio buttons, toggles, text inputs. If you have to use a drop down, think of ways you can use it better. So, make sure you can search, make sure you've got suggestions, sometimes a suggestion box. Use in-page overlays, or just not the native picker in an iPhone, because particularly on mobile you can't even see the bottom of the list, and you're like, you've got like a centimetre to try and scroll, and it just generally is a bad user experience that you don't need to have. If people use it because it's it's a standard form element that we've used since the start. Think about it before you use it.
And like I said, especially on mobile, the difference can be quite big if you move from one platform to another in how the form actually works with those drop-downs.
Definitely.
Yeah. It's lazy. And if the labels are quite big, then the font gets very small on the native date picker. There's a hard rule here. Only use drop downs if absolutely no alternative exists, right? And it's also it's fine to use them where you have limited space or it's not the primary modifier, right? So if a form is saying in order to continue you have to make a choice, right? That's bad to use a drop down there because the choices are hidden inside a black box, right? If it's something like a sort control on an e-commerce site, that's something that's been defaulted already. It's a modifier. It's not necessary to use the drop down in order to see the page, right? That's the big difference, right? So there are scenarios in which it is useful, but almost all other scenarios, there are better alternatives available.
Okay, then we have contrast and font issues.
Yeah, if you have any audience over sort of 35, 40 years old, then you're going to hit contrast issues in forms. We see this all the time. The error messages, the fields, the micro copy, the instructions, the error messages, right? A lot of these turn out to be really hard for people to read. And there's a couple of contrast and accessibility tools we put in the resource pack. Another common problem is that people have started to put text on pattern backgrounds, right? One word of advice: if you're a designer and cannot make a website look good without putting like italic text on top of pattern backgrounds, then you need to go back to design school, right? Because you cannot control the art direction on a responsive site of where the text is going to fall on the image, right? So by understanding that then means you cannot control whether the light text falls on a black bit or a light bit, which means for lots of people your text is unreadable. And I have an example from ASOS that I've published on LinkedIn. It's not just you that's doing this. Lots and lots of really big companies employ designers who do this stupid thing of putting text on a pattern background, and it makes it really, really hard to read. Imagine if instead of having white paper, we had paper with a herringbone or a dogtooth pattern on it, right? You try taking notes on that and see how you get on.
Yes, I think that's a big red flag showing you, the designer designed this on his nice big MacBook screen or iMac screen. but didn't use it on a mobile. Then the text is somewhere completely
and so
different.
the text is in a different place on the image than and that's the thing with the responsive sites. If you're floating text on patterns, you cannot really control where it lands unless you build it into the image. If you are going to put text on a pattern background, put it on a semi-transparent lozenge, right? Or put a piece of color space and have, shop all socks, so it's the sock collection, shop all socks. You can put this on a panel that floats on top of the background image, and then people can see the image, but they can also read and notice the call to action and the text that goes with it. There's no point in putting text on the background of something if people can't read it. You may as well have not written the text in the first place. And then the size of it, these accessibility tools will show you that there's a relationship between the contrast of the font, but also the size. The smaller the font gets, the harder it is to get decent contrast on it. So it's really important. If you are using body copy on your website, it should be 100% of browser default minimum, right? And if you are using serif fonts for your body copy, which actually take up a smaller font space internally within that shape, right? You need to max that to 130 or 150%, because those serif fonts are harder to read at the same size as the sans serif ones. Really important point that don't make your text too small, because then it makes it even harder to read, just like the contrast issue. And if you do both, then you're totally hosed.
Yeah, nice. And great. Now we've touched upon quite some things inside those forms. So now the question is, how do I go about finding out the problem areas on my forms?
So let's assume that you've been smart and installed a form analytics product. So you want to base it on the data. I mean, obviously, it's always good to interact with the form yourself, but let's look at the data. So what sort of data do you need to look at to see where the issues are? So the first part that people tend to go to is the abandonment data. So specifically, which was the last field that people interacted with on the form before they abandoned? Which is a good place to start, but you need to look at two things here. Firstly is the volume. That'll give you the areas where most people drop off. However, sometimes that will just be the submit button. Doesn't tell you everything because people are triggering errors on the submit button. And sometimes it'll be the first field, title, because you'll get a tire kicker who just clicks in and then goes out again. So you can't just look at that. You also need to look at the abandonment rate. So what proportion of people who interact with a field abandon on it. And that's important often when you've got conditional forms, if there's certain questions that only get shown to certain people. So we often see if there's an age checker field, so checking you're over 18, it has a massive abandonment rate because they're throwing out the under 18s. Doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but you've got to take all that into account.
I thought under 18s were smart enough just to enter an age that's high enough.
That's true. But yeah, but then abandonment, the next question is, okay, well, is that a good abandonment rate? It's higher, is it good or bad? Or, how do I understand if this is good or bad, or should I expect this? So, the first thing you can look at is benchmarks. So at Zuko, we have a number of benchmarks you can look on our website, and you can compare against that. You've got to be careful because every field and every form is different. So it's only a sense check. So you can take that as to say, okay, am I in the ballpark of this, being reasonable? But what we always like to do is to dig deeper. The hypothesis is you often get your best insights in looking at the behavioral differences between those who complete a form and those who abandon a form. So you look at the other data and compare those two segments. So for example, we often look at field returns, so people having to come back to a field, often driven by an error message. So you can then see, okay, if 50% of people who complete and 50% of people who abandon go back to the same field, you're like, okay, well, there's no difference there, so it doesn't tell me that this is necessarily a driver for abandonment. But if you see 50% of people who abandon go back to the phone number field and that 10% of those who complete go back to it, you can say there's a significant difference. I mean, you can test it statistically, of course, as well. But that's where you say, okay, there is a difference there. People who abandon are going back to the field and then they are ultimately abandoning. So that tells me I need to focus in on that field. You can do the same with time. Are there people spending more time if they abandon on that field versus complete? So it gets that difference in the data, really helps you hone in. And that's then when you overlay your experiential stuff, you're looking at the form, okay, why might that be? And that's when you create your hypothesis. You know where the issues are. You use the data and interacting with the form yourself to form those hypotheses and create the tests to optimize as you go forward.
Are there any, we mentioned analytics, form analytics tools a couple of times. Are there any specific tools that you guys want to mention or highlight for this? Or
Zuko, and that's the same one that Alan will mention. You can build your own stuff in Google Analytics, but it's just way, way harder. It's too much of a specialized area. I've only ever seen one person actually implement a half-decent event tracking model for forms. It's just get a specialized product to do this, and Zuko does it pretty well. But also have session replay as well, because session replay is going to give you some insights into the behavior, which will augment the data that you get. So you get a bit of qual data and a bit of quant data together on form interactions, and also usability test the forms too. That will give insights as well. But people always ask, what should my form conversion rate be? And the answer to that is, if you're into continuous improvement, it should be higher than it was last month, right? So if it's not changing every month, then you're not doing anything.
Exactly. That's always the answer, right? It should just be improving. whatever the competition is doing doesn't really matter.
Don't look at the competition. You are only competing with yourself, right? Make yours. If you concentrate on making yours better rather than looking at the size of everybody else's, then you might actually be better competition for them.
Alan, so I want to. So one question about Zuko itself. What's the one feature you think that Zuko currently has that people are underusing? That people should be using way more than they currently do?
It is probably the field flow. So you can see how people flow through the form. And that's also very important when you look at the submit button that we talked about before, because you can see how they flow through the form, going through nicely, hit submit button. Whoa, where do they go? Some of them jump out straight away, but some go way back to different things. And that's where, your nice flow disintegrates. And you can look at this on an aggregated basis, so you can get your answers pretty quickly just by looking at, I want to look at people who abandon, and I want to look at people who abandon who try to submit. What happens? And then you can get the answer quickly. That focuses you on the form. You can then look at some of the more detailed data, which then enables you to really focus in on these are the problem areas, overlay session replay, etc., and then form the hypotheses.
Nice. Okay. Next section. What are some things we can do to the forms that help people go through them faster? What are some time savers for those users?
Remove friction, get them through faster, or make things easier to actually complete depending on the device that they're using. So Baymard shows that about a quarter of people out there don't have any form of address lookup, right? If you think I really want to type my whole address in on a mobile keyboard, please don't make me do that. You can save, maybe a minute of my time, right? Just give me an address lookup. It's really easy to do. There are free solutions. You can use Google. There are also commercial ones. But when I've A/B testing, having an address lookup versus no address lookup, it's 5 to 35% improvement in checkout conversion rate. That's worth a lot of money, right? And it's amazing if people are able to find their address, right? Then there is a one-to-one correlation with their ability to actually convert, right? It's amazing. You should also make use of as many express or native payment integrations as you can. So that will either be device or browser specific, or it'll be a service specific. So you've got Google Pay, Amazon Pay, Apple Pay, you've got Shopify App Pay, you've got PayPal. right? And all of these offer single-click checkout options, right? No, you don't need to fill in your address. No, you don't need all the email and everything. It's like you go click, and then you're on the thank you page, right? You haven't had to go through the 7-step checkout. Do you think that will work or not? You have to test these things. Sometimes it's a smoke test to work out what payment options would get me the biggest return if I offered them on my site, and then you offer them. But, don't be an idiot here. If 70% of your revenue, a lot of Western European sites, about 50 to 70% of their revenue will be coming from Apple devices. Why don't you have Apple Pay on your website? That would be crazy. So, you can run an A/B test or smoke test to find out these, but generally speaking, offer one-click express payment options or native integrated payment options.
Yeah, and make sure to offer local payment options if you have. For example, with the Netherlands, Ideal is a big payment option here in the Netherlands. If you don't, I guess if you offer that in addition to PayPal and credit card, that will greatly increase payment from the Netherlands at least. And it was actually so to make things faster. I would assume that when you work with clients, often it also comes down to removing a lot of fields. I mean, we've been talking about specific elements of the form. But removing form fields, I mean, I see a lot of forms that include information where the person or team building that form says, okay, but that's nice to have for us as a company. We would like to know their company name or their country of operation or the department or their function title. But really, you're only sending them a booklet or a PDF or a white paper. The only real thing that you need is an email address to do that, and all the extra stuff.
It's a trade-off, It's a trade-off between. Yeah. I often ask people, what are these fields used for? What is the life of this field after they press the submit button? And if you don't know that, then you're not able to challenge whether that information is required, even valid. The information may actually be putting people off. But don't fall into this trap of thinking that removing fields is the game, right? Because I've discovered several times. So on a booking sites, let's say if you're booking a music band or clowns to come to your children's party, right? Okay. Let's say we decide we want to remove the field off there that says, do you have any other special requirements, right? Because we think that more people will convert if there's less fields. But actually, it's really important for them to tell you their special requirements for this gig. Oh, it's going to be this kind of party. We're going to be in this situation. We need you to turn up half an hour before. It's really important for me to give you that information, yet you have taken away the field that would allow me to supply it. So therefore, I don't have confidence that you will then be able to offer me the service that I wanted. So actually removing fields can harm conversion in some cases if this is information that people want to give or expect should be given in order for you to be able to process or somehow make the service work. So sometimes people think, well, how are they going to be able to do that if they haven't asked me for the date or the time of when I want my thing, right? You're sort of thinking, why haven't they asked me for the date? I need to give them the date because it's my son's birthday, right? He needs to have it on this day. And they might be thinking, oh, we'll ask them for that information later, but it may have actually put people off converting.
Yeah.
And I'd like to add to that as well. You know, obviously you don't want to be asking, pointless things, but it's not always the most important factor. Across our database, we see some of the longest forms are the biggest converters. The classic example is local government forms. They convert about 85% across our database, despite the fact they average 71 different inputs. They are the longest.
But I guess the user motivation for those will be quite very high. Well, motivation not necessarily that I want to do this, but it's the only place I can do this. So
there's no competition.
Well, yeah, like I say, there's a general principle. You don't want to be asking things you don't need to. doesn't always correlate to conversion rates. You've got to overlay the motivation.
But that doesn't mean that you're allowed to design evil forms, right? Simply because you work in local government.
Yeah, I think some of them do, to be fair.
In fact, there should be a bigger onus upon you because so many people are using them that by putting pain and friction into your lives, you're actually harming your local populace, which I guess is against the whole reason for you being there as a local authority in the first place, is not to do things like that. So don't put friction into, don't scale friction into millions of people's lives, please.
And last one, the transition between stages. So often forms are cut up between different pages or tabs, or however you want to define that. How can we make that transition easier?
Yeah, what's the ideal form length? That's I've run so many tests, and it's about the kind of psychology of the chunking. It's how things are grouped, right, and whether they feel that they're being put into logical steps that you would kind of expect, and that can be within a form, right? So you might have 3 sections to fill within a form, which are actually 3 kind of interactions. So some sites chunk these out into single steps, like gov.uk is 1 question at a time. How old are you? Where do you live, right? And that would be exhausting for e-commerce, right? But for the type of things that they're doing, where it has to be accessible to a wide range of people with different cognitive abilities, right? They need to make it very, very, very simple, right? So you've got to be aware of the context. But the big thing about this transitioning stuff and handling people's movement through the forms is you need to make sure that it works, right? Because we find that there are forms where you can't go back or forward within the form. AO.com is a retailer, beautiful usability and some great stuff on their website, but their checkout, you can go back and forward in it and it doesn't wipe or lose any of the information. You can go out to the rest of the website, look at another product and come back to the checkout, and all the information you filled in earlier on is still there because it's got session state handling, right? So, handling, never break the back button, allow people to go back and forward, allow people to exit the process and come back in again, right? Don't wipe or lose their information, right? And make sure that you handle things like basket state. Don't throw their basket away after 15 minutes, right? The phone could ring, the doorbell goes, and then you come back and your basket is empty. So you need to think about how you keep that information investment that people have already made and not destroy it.
It happens so often too by a girlfriend that she starts shopping one day and then gets distracted and then wants to continue the next day and then everything gone. This whole
basket
shopping list
gone.
of 50 items.
There's a basket timeout. Notice on Amazon, right? Anyone tell me what the basket timeout is on Amazon? Never.
Yeah, that's one. If you want to remove it people can remove it. So why remove it for them?
Yeah, I go to another computer like 3 weeks later. Oh, it's still there in my basket. Great. That's what I want, right?
Exactly. So we've reached the end of our nice list. Any final comments on how to approach this as an optimization team, or where to get started with this?
Well, firstly, I say, obviously I'm slightly biased, but make sure you have data specifically for the form, not just Google Analytics, whether that's Zuko, whether it's, Content Square, whatever it is, make sure you're looking at each individual field.
I guess Google Analytics works if you have the fields on a separate page each time, like Craig just mentioned. But
but it's math. Why spend half a day setting that up when you can spend 10 minutes?
Yeah,
and you can collect that stuff, but then it's incredibly difficult to analyze, right? That's the problem, because people do not go through a form linearly, step by step, right? They jump around a lot. So how are you going to make sense of that? It's actually quite hard to do analysis of that stuff, and that's where Zuko gives you a shortcut to that type of analysis, because they've worked out how to do it for you already. For me, it's you need qual and quant tools, so session replay, as well as something like Zuko. You need real device hardware to actually test your forms on. And, you need to have some kind of design pattern system here to have a consistent way of handling everything that you do on forms. It's like a forms vocabulary, and some people will call it a design system or a design pattern library. Either way, build a set of reusable components that work and just keep using them. Stop inventing new forms or different styles of forms, right? Find one thing, right? One core atomic pattern from a field level and build this up into your design pattern for all your forms. And then at least if it's broken everywhere the same way, and you can fix it everywhere the same way.
Exactly. Yeah, and I would actually argue that everyone has Google Analytics because it's free, but I would argue that having a form, if you're in optimization and you needed to choose between a Google Analytics tool or form analytics tool, assuming you have forms on your website converting people, I think the form analytics tool will be way more helpful to you than Google Analytics. Nice. So we have a really big list of show notes for everyone listening. Very helpful, I think, in if you want to get started and as context to what we just spoke about. A lot of links in there, so make sure to check those out, and of course, make sure to check Zooko out. My final question for both of you, and I want a different answer from both of you. Who should I invite for next episode of the Zero Cafe podcast?
I'll jump in first there. We've talked about Luke Wroblewski many times. If you could get him, you should.
Wroblewski.
Wroblewski, sorry. If you could get him, I would definitely get him. And he wrote a great book a number of years ago. So just understanding that it seems to be very relevant, and see how things have changed since then.
Okay, yeah.
My recommendation to you, Guido, is the person who wrote the precursor to that book, Caroline Jarrett. And Caroline has been working for decades doing qual survey work, improving the core UX of surveys and forms, right? And people's interactions with them, both in the public sphere, but also in the kind of private and commercial sector, right? Stone cold. She knows more about this stuff than anyone else on the planet. She has a new book out about designing good surveys. Everybody who does anything in CRO should read that book because it's a gold mine of information. So she should be on your list because I'm sure you would find talking to her absolutely fascinating.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for this episode. Thank you for your time, and I hope to talk to you guys soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode. And as always, you can find the show notes for this episode on our website, www.zero.cafe. Talk to you next time, and always be optimizing.